I recommend Slay the Spire. Actually, wait. Before I can even recommend this game, we have to talk about how these recommendations are supposed to be used. But even before that, we have to talk about how this game is still in early access, and how much this game may change before the final release. Because it does appear to be changing, in ways that seem likely to prevent me from making a recommendation for Slay the Spire's final form. Understanding those concerns will require some familiarity with the game though, so we're going to be doing all of this backwards. Slay the Spire fits into a number of genres, but its roguelike elements define it best. Players choose one of 3 characters, then climb floors one after another, attempting to reach the top of the titular spire. Each floor presents the player with battles, events, or opportunities to rest or shop for items and cards. Whether the player reaches the highest floor of the spire and defeats the boss, or scrubs out against some of the lesser enemies, the game ends, presents you a score, and resets itself. There are some minor progression elements in the very beginning of the game. You must unlock 2 of the 3 starting classes, for instance, and each of your early runs provide you with progress toward unlocking new cards and relics to add to the game's pool of options. These quickly shrink in the rearview mirror though, and serve only to keep new players engaged while they work out the game's mechanics via trial and bloody error. Dying is definitely a learning experience. The game's card-based combat mechanics differ significantly from similar titles in ways that take some getting used to. Rules that used to be universal don't always apply here. For example, in most deck building games, a thinner deck is better since you always want to be playing your best cards, which are, typically, in limited supply. But the appearance of cards that do nothing, or actively hurt you in Slay the Spire, like curses and statuses, make it possible for a deck of only a few good cards to be overwhelmed when enemies quickly pump in burns or stuns. Now your 5-card deck is a 15-card deck that's 2/3 garbage. Otherwise, you're offered the same choices any card game asks you to make. The sequence you play your cards in matters. You have to consider what's in your draw and discard piles anytime you might draw. Draws are more complex, however, as you discard your entire hand at the end of each turn, and the energy you have to spend is limited. Top decking your best card becomes groan-inducing when you don't have enough energy to play it, and at higher difficulties, avoiding situations like this becomes a critical concern. The game does have RPG elements, but I'm hesitant to actually call the game an RPG. There's no real progress or experience. Concepts like HP, damage, and statuses describe elements of the combat, but increasingly the game is less about the beats of each turn, and more about the choices the player makes in between battles. Each victory in combat offers the player an opportunity to add a card to their deck. Tougher opponents, along with shops and events, grant the option to add more cards, relics with permanent effects, single-use potions, or to remove unwanted cards. Deciding when to take any of these, and which to choose over the others, is far more important in determining the long-term success of a run than the individual choices of which attacks to play against which targets. Players that struggle with the combat mechanics during early fights will find that adding new cards doesn't solve their basic problem, while even an optimal player will find many fights impossible with a rubbish deck. Optimal players rarely encounter rubbish decks though, because passing on janky cards and choosing the right combination of attacks, skills, and powers is the fundamental skill required by Slay the Spire. Ultimately, the game is an endurance run where the player must preserve their HP by making choices that protect it in the short term, while still serving the long-term goal of building a deck that can preserve it throughout the rest of the run. Deck building wisdom and careful resource management are the twin pillars of gameplay. I think that's enough of an overview to explain this recommendation. I can say, without reservation, that I love this game in its current state. I've clocked over 330 hours in the Spire, with a win rate on the highest difficulty that's slowly been climbing from 33% to between 50 and 75%. It's been a fair, if challenging, pleasure. Almost every run is beatable, with some players having over 90% success rates. For the $10 I paid in, I can say that this was one of my best game purchases of all time, even if I never boot it up again. So what's with the asterisk on this review? Well, let's talk about difficulty. After defeating the boss at the top of the Spire for the first time, the game unlocks Ascension mode. Each Ascension adds more difficulty by buffing enemies, reducing rewards, removing healing, shuffling a curse into your starting deck, etc., etc. Beating one Ascension unlocks a next, until at last players reach the highest difficulty the game has to offer. This is the part where we have to talk about how I intend my recommendations to be used, because I'm about to veer sharply away from reporting facts and critiquing them, and into the oncoming traffic of opinion. When I recommend a game, I am trusting that my viewers have played many of the other games I have recommended. I don't even expect them to have watched those recommendation videos. Instead, if they look at the list of games I've enjoyed and find that it matches up closely with the games that they've enjoyed, they can reasonably infer that there's a good chance they'll also enjoy the other titles on that list, titles they may not have tried yet. No two people will have exactly the same taste in games, however, so these videos will give me a chance to explain what aspects of those games I have enjoyed. In this way, my viewers can avoid false positives and prune my list down to the subset of tastes that we share. These videos aren't reviews or critiques, or at least they don't have enough of those components that I would label them that way. A good review should go as in-depth as possible to offer the reader as much information as they would need to make a confident purchase, while a competent critique should offer a greater understanding of the game's meaning, or break down the effects of various game components for further use by later creators, games being both art and mechanism, and so subject to multiple types of critique. I am formally trained to critique art and write in-depth reviews. I have the loan debt to prove it. I also have a background in coding and game development, but I don't want to apply those talents here. Established creators are already doing that, and it's not the kind of work I feel like doing in my spare time. Right now, I just want to share my experiences with other people who are like me, who enjoy the same things as me, because that's a low-effort way to enrich all of our lives. So when I say that adding more Ascensions to Slay the Spire might prevent me from recommending it, that information may or may not be useful to you. It's definitely just my opinion. But I'm going to make a case for it, such as to forewarn my potential doppelgangers out there in the vastness of the internet. This review is being recorded in late August 2018, before Ascensions 16 through 20 have been added to the release branch of the game. Currently, the highest difficulty is Ascension 15, where the game is almost always possible to beat with optimal play. Early Ascensions give players a chance to experiment with cards and try to force a deck centered around a certain mechanic, but as the difficulty increases, over-specialized decks quickly become obsolete as the game asks players to prepare to deal with a number of disparate fights that have to be handled in different ways. A deck capable of consistently playing 15 or 20 low-impact cards each turn might work against the base difficulty, but has no chance of succeeding against the boss that automatically ends your turn and buffs after every 12th card you play on Ascension 15. Since players can't know which boss they will face in each act before reaching it, those who don't cover all of their bases can easily find themselves in an unwinnable situation when using these tactics. Veteran players will recommend building a deck that handles the immediate situation, with an eye on having an answer for each of the possible upcoming bosses. Tragically, this ends up making the deck composition, or at least the deck strategy, far more homogeneous as the player progresses, while the enemies, relics, and card pools stay the same. Still, the desire to master a game of this depth and difficulty will be strong in most players who stay the course. Ascension 15 in its current state offers a reward for that perseverance. At the end of the tunnel, there's a near-perfect record within reach to prove your mastery of the Spire's mechanics. I like that challenge. It's provable, attainable, and difficult enough to be coveted. My own intelligence and skill level is a perfect match to keep me close enough to this prize that I think with another 100 hours or so, I might grasp it. I had intended to put those 100 hours in. This is where my recommendation ends. Ascensions 16 through 20 have been added to the beta branch for balancing before final release, and early analysis suggests that these difficulties are likely to be much harder, to the point where optimal play can frequently be defeated by random chance or incomplete information. The developers don't know if these difficulties will be win-streakable, but their focus seems to be on per-run player engagement and not on a tangible completion state. The community is barely divided on the issue, with the vast majority eagerly awaiting a more punishing and capricious game. I am not attempting to predict the future. We still have basically no data to work on anyway, but at the very least the desired outcome for this game's final release is obvious to me, and it's not to my taste. It's only natural to want to play your game of choice on the highest difficulty, whether that's optional or not, and I don't intend to punt hour-long segments of my life to the whims of RNGesus. Such a game is best left for players who easily conceptualize optimal play as a thing happening internally, and who have no difficulty getting positive feedback from knowing that they made the right decisions, even if those decisions got them killed. That thinking comes naturally to some people, but it's worked for me, and in my own view, indicative of mistakes in a game's design. After all, the clearest possible feedback is part of the best possible play loop. Personally, I'm hanging up my potion belt for now until the game's final release. I'll have a second look at that time, but for now, watching it diverge from my ideal is a bit too heartbreaking. Hopefully that speaks to how highly I regard it in its current form. I have to recommend the game as it is now in the most superlative terms. It's the best game I've played since Dark Souls. You should play it too. Just be aware of that asterisk.